As fans of video games, it can sometimes be easy to forget that every time a studio produces a title, they're effectively taking a gamble. After all, games are pricey things to produce, and as with any business, a large investment doesn't always guarantee a good return. If a studio produces good quality games that make good money, then it's likely they'll continue to do so for years to come. Unless they're acquired by EA, of course, because then they're just shut down without mercy, but that's an issue for another list, isn't it? Sadly though, if a developer is stung by a naff game or two in a row, it can spell the beginning of the end. For this list then, we're looking at games that proved to be the final nail in the coffin of their respective studios, whether it was due to poor reception, bad sales, or a combination of the two. It doesn't necessarily matter if they ended up being the final game that a developer actually worked on, but what's important is that they were significant enough to set the wheels of closure in motion. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 video games that killed their developers. Number 10. Lair, Factor 5. To say that the development of Lair was troubled is something of an understatement. According to those who were working at Factor 5, the entire experience was a dumpster fire. Founded in 1987, Factor 5 enjoyed a great deal of success throughout the 80s and 90s, forging relationships with the likes of Nintendo and LucasArts. Things began to sour in the early 2000s, however, particularly with LucasArts, and the company was forced to reach out to other publishers. Sony answered the call and agreed to work with the studio to create Animal Wars and Lair, provided they were PlayStation exclusives, of course. The team working on Lair was incredibly talented, but missed deadlines, Sony's interference, and uncomfortable working conditions at the studio resulted in a hot mess of a game. In August 2006, Sony cancelled Animal Wars after being turned off by the idea of animals killing each other in a war setting. When Lair finally released in 2007, it was critically panned, and Sony even went as far as to release a reviewer's guide after the negative press began rolling in. Factor 5's relationship with Sony was then terminated, and though they were able to secure a deal with Brash Games to produce a tie-in for a sequel to Superman Returns, this ultimately fell through, effectively killing the studio. Number 9. Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, Instigate Games. You wouldn't have thought a Call of Duty game could be so bad that it caused the closure of a studio. After all, if you look up cash cow in the dictionary, you probably find a picture of Captain Price sat on a throne made of money. Not all of the games have been winners, however, and though the series' main titles ensure that Activision's champagne flutes never run dry, the same can't be said of some of the spin-offs. One such dud was 2012's Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, a game with too many colons and not enough substance. Developed by Instigate Games for the PS Vita and released alongside the infinitely superior COD Blops 2, COD Blops Declassified set the player on a number of different missions that take place between the first two Blops games. Though the studio had never soared to the heights of some of its peers, Instigate Games had turned out some decent-ish titles over the years, including Vampire the Masquerade Redemption and 2007's Conan. Sadly though, when the studio announced a restructure in 2012 thanks to Declassified's failure, they were unable to reach any agreements with other companies, and Instigate was forced to close their doors for good. Number 8. Unit 13, Zipper Interactive. In fairness to Unit 13, it didn't fire the fatal shot into the chest of Zipper Interactive, but it did just stand by while the studio gasped for air and failed to call an ambulance. Try not to think too hard about that analogy, I assure you our writer didn't. Famed for developing excellent titles such as MechWarrior 3, Crimson Skies, and the outstanding SOCOM series, Zipper Interactive was acquired in 2006 by Sony Computer Entertainment. In the following years, they produced several more good games, but luck wasn't on their side when it came to the all-important sales. Whilst 2010's MAG was well received by fans, it didn't sell particularly well, and 2011's SOCOM 4 launched just as the PSN then outage hit, which dramatically impacted the game's revenue. Things were already looking bad for Zipper Interactive, but when PSP exclusive Unit 13 failed to perform, the studio's fate was sealed, and Sony swooped in to close it down. In hindsight, and the fact that Microsoft seems to be buying up companies that own huge FPS franchises like it's going out of fashion, shuttering a studio that produced PlayStation exclusive shooters was probably not the best maneuver on Sony's part. They do say, if you close your zipper too quickly, you can't be surprised if things end up in a pinch. Number 7. 007 Legends, Eurocom. Although the crossover in a Venn diagram of the greatest games of all time and Eurocom's back catalogue would be fairly slim, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the developer was responsible for a lot of reasonably good games. Mostly the studio worked on home console ports of arcade titles, as well as some movie tie-ins, and though some were less good than others, the studio still enjoyed reasonable financial success. Things took a turn in the 2010s, however, and though the likes of GoldenEye 007 got an okay reception from critics, sales of Eurocom games started to decline. It was 2012's 007 Legends that struck the killing blow though, as the game garnered some absolutely dismal review scores, particularly on the PC, which averaged just 16% on game rankings, resulting in lackluster sales. Subsequently, Eurocom fired 75% of its staff, and a number of Activision-published James Bond games, including 007 Legends, were pulled from digital storefronts without warning or explanation, further compounding Eurocom's cash flow problem. Down to just 50 employees and crippled financially thanks to the failure of 007 Legends and the delay of a number of contracts, Eurocom went into administration in December 2012, laying off the remainder of its team and ceasing operations forever. Number 6. Ghostbusters 2016 Fireforge games. Regardless of how you feel about the 2016 Ghostbusters reboot, I think we can all agree that the tie-in video game was a complete joke. If you don't recognize the name of the developer, Fireforge Games, well, we can't say that we blame you. After all, pretty much the only game of theirs that ever saw release was Ghostbusters, so it's no wonder they're not exactly memorable. The studio was formed in 2011 by ex-Blizzard employee Tim Campbell, and was, at one point or another, working on games of the MOBA variety. Little is known about these projects, aside from the fact that they were codenamed Zeus and Atlas, and that they were going to be published by Razer and Tencent, respectively. The relationships got messy, however, and both publishers ended up suing Fireforge for their failure to deliver the promised titles. The situation was already pretty dire then, by the time Ghostbusters was released, and if anything, the game just put the studio out of its misery. Plagued by scathing reviews, poor sales, and practically unwinnable lawsuits, Fireforge filed for bankruptcy on July 15th, 2016, just 3 days after Ghostbusters' release. Who you gonna call? Well, a decent solicitor would probably be a good place to start, I think. Oh, that's awkward. Number 5. APB All Points Bulletin Real-Time Worlds. In 2007, if you'd have asked anyone affiliated with the games industry where they thought Crackdown developer Real-Time Worlds would be in 3 years, most would probably have said things like enjoying the success of another brilliant title or collecting yet another BAFTA. I'd be willing to bet my bottom dollar that absolutely no one would have predicted the studio's collapse, and yet that was exactly what happened. Following the release of Crackdown in 2007, it seemed like Real-Time Worlds was unstoppable. Not only did the game receive a plethora of awards, but the company was attracting investors left, right, and center. In fact, by 2010, over $100 million had been invested in the company. Following a protracted development period, however, the studio's next game, APB All Points Bulletin, released to a less than stellar reception, garnering a score of just 58 out of 100 on Metacritic. Critics were already suspicious of the game's credentials after an embargo was placed on APB, preventing outlets from publishing reviews until a week after its launch. 2 weeks later, Real-Time Worlds announced a restructure, which is usually business speak for layoffs, and in August 2010, just 6 weeks after the release of APB, the company went into administration. Number 4. Homefront Chaos Studios. If there's one thing to be learned from 2011's Homefront, it's that a disappointing game can be just as dangerous to a studio as a bad one. Chaos Studio was formed in 2006 by publisher THQ, who was looking to create a studio that was focused on making brilliant first-person shooters. Their first title, 2008's Frontline's Fuel of War, did well with both critics and players, and though it was no Call of Duty, it was a fun FPS with decent multiplayer capabilities. Things seemed to be going well for the new studio, and they got straight to work developing Homefront, a game that carried some lofty expectations from THQ's execs. The thing was, Homefront wasn't bad at all, it just wasn't as good as people thought it was going to be. The game had a decent story and solid multiplayer, but the campaign was a bit on the short side, and one or two aspects of the gameplay were, I don't know, a little generic. And so sadly, the praise that Homefront did receive wasn't enough to distract from the negative criticism, and following its release, THQ suffered a 26% stock drop. Unsurprisingly then, just 3 months later, THQ closed Chaos Studios and placed their Montreal studio in charge of the Homefront franchise. Number 3. Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness, Core Design. Though the studio was arguably most famous for creating the Tomb Raider series, Core Design had actually been around for a while before Lara Croft burst onto the scene, producing several games per year before being acquired by Eidos Interactive in 1996. Naturally, when a game is as good as Tomb Raider was, it's going to get sequels, and between 1997 and 2002, the studio developed half a dozen games for the franchise. The first few were pretty good, but the more they churned out, the more the quality seemed to decline. Then, in 2003, Core Design developed Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness, which was universally panned, garnering average review scores of just 52 and 49 for the PS2 and PC releases, respectively. After the game bombed critically, Eidos put Crystal Dynamics in charge of the series, and several members of the Core Design team left the company. In 2006, Core Design was acquired by Rebellion Developments, and remnants of the team ended up working on titles like Rogue Warrior and Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails. These games were, let's face it, awful as well, and when the lease expired on their office in Derby in 2010, the studio was finally closed. Number 2. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, Robo Modo. If you were to pop onto Metacritic and type the words Tony Hawk's Pro Skater into the search bar, you'd get a nice, satisfying list of results, each with a little green box next to them, indicating that they are all good games. All except for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, that is. Prior to 2008, the vast majority of Tony Hawk games were developed by Neversoft, but when Activision acquired the rights to the Guitar Hero series, the studio began working on that instead. Keen to keep the series alive though, Activision brought in Robo Modo. The studio produced two mediocre peripheral-based spin-offs, Tony Hawk Ride and Tony Hawk Shred, as well as the equally meh Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. With the expiry of the Tony Hawk license looming, Robo Modo were tasked with developing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 in just a few short months, and unsurprisingly, the results were bad. The game was released unfinished and was basically unplayable without an 8GB day one patch. Critics slaughtered the game upon its release, citing everything from its design to its numerous technical problems as reasons for its failure. Less than a year later, Robo Modo closed its doors, and the series lay dormant until 2020, when it was successfully revived by Vicarious Visions. And number 1, Haze, Free Radical Design. As we said in the intro, it can take just one bad game to sink a studio, and although they were renowned for producing the outstanding Time Splitters series, one misstep from Free Radical Studios spelled disaster. First announced at E3 2006, Haze was a highly anticipated first-person shooter that received so much hype that some people believed it would be PlayStation's answer to the Halo series. Upon its release, however, Haze garnered a fairly mediocre response, with critics panning its plot, gameplay mechanics, and overall design. Behind the scenes, Free Radical had also been working on Star Wars Battlefront 3, but it was cancelled just before it was finished. Soon after, the the release of Haze and the cancellation of Battlefront 3, the company went bankrupt. Free Radical was bought by Crytek, but in the following years, they suffered from financial difficulties of their own, and the remaining staff ended up being transferred to Dambuster Studios in 2014. The good news, though, is that in May 2021, it was announced that Free Radical would be reforming as a subsidiary of Deep Silver. Several members of the original team, including founders Steve Ellis and David Doak, are back and are currently working on a brand new Time Splitters game. I love a happy ending.